for coming out tonight. This is a tremendous crowd and a wonderful way to kick off this year's Amicus Curiae lecture series. I see many people out here who've been coming since the beginning, and you might be interested to know that we are now starting the 7th year of the lecture series. So thank you for your support. So something I think about a lot when planning the lecture series is what is the purpose of a lecture series like this one? And to me, the purpose is not only to inform, although that is one of the purposes, but it's also to reflect, to question, to consider new and different ideas, and to shake us out of our complacency. As someone who's the director of a Center for Constitutional Democracy, I'm a pretty big fan of democracy, but our first speaker this year is pretty well known for writing a book called Against Democracy. And when I started to explore it, I thought, what's that all about? And what it's about is very interesting. I mean, he has really insightful and thoughtful ideas. I think he epitomizes the kinds of things that I'm talking about that fulfills the purpose of a lecture series, and I'm really excited he's here with us. Tonight's lecturer is Jason Brennan, who is the Flanagan Family Chair of Strategy, Economics, Ethics, and Public Policy at Georgetown University's McDonough School of Business. Dr. Brennan holds a PhD from the University of Arizona in philosophy, and his scholarly work focuses on the intersection of economics, politics, and philosophy. He has undergraduate degrees in both economics and philosophy, which he earned at the University of New Hampshire before also earning his master's there prior to getting his PhD at Arizona. He is a prolific writer, scholarly articles, popular articles, as well as several highly regarded books. Most relevant for us, he's the author of The Ethics of Voting and Against Democracy, as I said. His latest book, When All Else Fails, Resistance, Violence, and State Injustice, will be coming out in 2018, as will another book that he co-authored called In Defense of Openness, Global Justice and Global Freedom. His books have been translated into 10 languages and read all over the world. Against Democracy made Der Spiegel's bestseller list, and he also has a significant presence on television where he's been on PBS, C-SPAN, CNN, Fox Business Network, and various others. I am really excited that he's here tonight, and I'd like you to join me in welcoming Jason Brennan to Marshall University.
So, thank you very much for having me here tonight. It's really pleasant to be able to spend this evening with you. And you said, you introduced me that part of the spirit of academia is provocation and to question things that we take for granted. And in all frankness, that was part of my rationale for writing this book. I started reading at great interest the philosophical field known as democratic theory, and I noticed that there was an almost religious fervor for democracy within that field, and very few people questioned the basic axioms and assumptions. I also noticed that the field of democratic theory, as done by philosophers, didn't pay very much attention to empirical work on democratic behavior as done by empirically minded political scientists. And so in a sense, this book is meant to see what would happen if we put these two things together. And that's what it's all about. So, but to answer the question, is democracy the best system? I'll tell you ahead of time, I'm a pretty big fan of democracy. I'm also a really big fan of the heavy metal band Iron Maiden, right? But Iron Maiden has its flaws, you know, and democracy has its flaws as well. Now, democracy may very well be the very best system that we can come up with, and it's certainly the best system we've come up with so far, and perhaps Iron Maiden is the best heavy metal band we've had so far too. But, all right, awesome. So, but nevertheless, there might be some issues about it, and perhaps we can fix them. So I often ask people, like, government does a lot of really good things. It also messes up a lot. We might disagree about what's good and what it messes up, but I think we all agree that some things are good and some things are bad. And we want to ask, why does it make mistakes? Why is it messing up? Who's at fault for the mistakes that it makes? There are lots of people that we can point our fingers at. We all love blaming, so we can point to the corporations, and the unions, and the special interest groups, and the lobbyists. I mean, I work in DC, and there are plenty of lobbyists. My neighbors are lobbyists. They're all around. We can blame all of them, and we're right to do so. But then when we're done, we should do one of these. Because the thing is, at the end of the day, democracy actually works in the sense that what we vote for, the things that we as a group tend to support, have a pretty high tendency to be implemented by government. And that should both make you feel warm and fuzzy, but also scare you. Because what if we don't know what we're talking about? So for instance, in any major election, economic issues are one of the major things that are being discussed and debated. But what if the median voter, the voter that has the most power, would fail Econ 101, as in fact he would? Issues about crime are being debated. What if the median voter doesn't know anything about crime and doesn't understand criminology and doesn't understand the causes of it, as in fact he doesn't? What if war is one of the perennial things? What do we do about global security? What if the median voter doesn't have the ability to identify other countries on the map and doesn't really know what's going on and doesn't understand these problems as he or she doesn't? Well, if that were the case, there's a good chance that that voter is not going to support candidates and politicians and parties that actually promote what her goals are. Instead, they might vote for things that actually backfire. And that's the worry. Now, I have here a picture of my in-laws. I like to tell a story about them, even though this is being recorded and might get me in trouble, right? So here's, we call them Gran and Pop. That's what my kids call them. And they're wonderful people. They're better people than I am, right? They're elders in their church. They give a significant amount of money to a charity. They're constantly doing things to help other people. They're really among the most virtuous people I know, except when it comes to politics. Suddenly, when they get involved in politics, things change. So for instance, my mother-in-law has from time to time, she used to watch the Bill O'Reilly show in order to get angry at him and then throw coat hangers at the television show, right? Sometimes we get in disagreements about things, and she'll ask me about some research in political science, and I'll say, oh, it's interesting, let me tell you about these articles that came out in APSR last year, and then she'll say, those guys must be a bunch of Republican shills because she disagrees with them, and when in fact they're not, right? And in general, like if you have any kind of argument with her, and with my father-in-law to a lesser extent about political issues, they'll just get really mad and go, I just believe in a society based on love, and kind of go and sulk. Right? And further, it turns out all of their new friends happen to be Democrats like they are, and they have a very difficult time being friends with Republicans. The thing is, they're normal. That kind of behavior is normal. That is what is to be expected among people when it comes to politics. This is how people behave. So the great political economist, philosopher, early feminist writer John Stuart Mill wrote a little pamphlet called Considerations on Representative Government. He didn't actually advocate democracy per se, he advocated something called epistocracy, which we'll get to later. But in that book, he had a hypothesis. He said, if I can just get the average person to participate more in politics, this will enlighten and ennoble them. What it will do is it'll be like getting the average factory worker in Manchester, England, to see that other people's interests matter and there's a bigger world. It would be like getting a fish to discover that there's a world outside of the ocean. So Mill had a hypothesis that participation in politics would educate us and enlighten us. But he would admit, at the time he was writing, there weren't very many democratic countries or representative countries. It was an untested hypothesis. Joseph Schumpeter, writing a bit later, had a different hypothesis. He thought that if we get people to participate in politics, they'll become infantile. He says that they'll start reasoning in a way that they would recognize as primitive and infantile in the sphere of their legitimate interests. So the question is, he also didn't really have the data to back it up. So who's right? Well, unfortunately, now we have lots and lots of data. Now we have lots of experiments. Now we have lots of evidence one way or another. And unfortunately, it looks like Schumpeter is right and Mill is wrong. That politics tends to stultify us and corrupt us rather than enlighten and ennoble us. So in the book, I talk about there's a wide variety in how voters are. Voters vary in what they know, how much they know, how strongly they hold their beliefs, whether they have any beliefs in the first place, how long their opinions last. There's tremendous variation. But nevertheless, you can roughly separate voters into two major categories, what I call hobbits and hooligans. So if you've ever seen the Lord of the Rings films, or if you've read the Lord of the Rings books, or the actual book The Hobbit, you've encountered these guys, the hobbits, right? And what are hobbits like? They're just simple people. They kind of like have a English pastoral lifestyle. They don't care about the outside world. They don't care about adventure. They don't care about the grand going on in the land of Middle Earth. All they care about is just like eating their breakfast and their second breakfast and something called the Levensies and lunch and a snack and smoking their pipes and having a grand old time. And roughly, their political analog of this would be roughly half of the American population. The typical non-voter in the United States, the person who chooses to stay home, when we go and study that person, what we find is the reason they don't participate is because they just don't find it interesting. They just don't care very much. It's not that they're dumb, it's not that they're mean, it's just that they're more interested in their day-to-day affairs or the affairs of their church or the affairs of their hobbies or whatever else than they are in politics. That person doesn't really have very many political opinions. They tend to be politically moderate, not because they're ideologically committed to being moderate, but because it's the easiest, least path of least resistance. And they just don't participate and don't vote and aren't that interested. On the other hand, they're what I call hooligans. So I've been to soccer games in countries where people really care about soccer. We don't really care about it here, but in other countries they do. And like, for example, I was in Sao Paulo about a decade ago, seeing the Sao Paulo city team versus the Sao Paulo state team. And there people were so rabid about the game that they actually would not let fans of the other team sit with each other because they might fight. Whereas I've been in Yankee Stadium like wearing Red Sox gear and nothing happened, right? So what's going on with hooligans? Well, some people might be rabid sports fans. And the thing about sports fans is they often know a lot about the game. They can tell you about football games that took place 30 years ago and what the score was and what they did on like 4th and 3 and whether they decide to go for it or not. They'll remember all this stuff. But they process the information in a very biased way. Consider, for instance, the question about whether Tom Brady was in some way responsible for deflating footballs. You and I have access to exactly the same data. None of us here, I assume, are football insiders. Now, when Tom Brady's accused of deflating footballs, what does everybody from New England say? Is he guilty or not? Not guilty. They get the right answer. And then everyone else in the country, when they ask, was he responsible for deflating footballs, what do they say? Of course he was, right? In the same way that, like, if my brother and I are watching a baseball game, he's a Yankees fan, unfortunately, and I'm a Red Sox fan. Like, if the player is called out, if it's my guy, I'm like, what, is the umpire blind? And he's like, of course, that was a fair call. We have access to the same data and the same information, but we're processing it in a way that flatters what we would like to believe. We are motivated to believe what we want rather than what's true. So the political analog of this would be a hooligan in politics. And the typical person who votes is a hooligan so described. For them, their political identity forms part of their identity. It's not just I happen to be Democrat, I happen to be Republican, I happen to be Libertarian, I happen to be Marxist. Rather, that is who I am. And you can't change that. And you think, anyone who has my politics, I'm inclined to be friends. But the people who don't have my politics, they're probably stupid and evil, or at least deeply, deeply misguided. Right? I constantly search for the news. I don't search for truth. What I do is I look for news that shows that I'm already right. And if someone shows me new information or new data or new stuff that shows that I might be wrong, I find it boring. I just don't pay any attention to it. Or I assume that the people writing it are biased and evil. And when we go and look at the psychology of voters, roughly the other half of Americans are like this. In the book, I talk about a group I call Vulcans. If you've ever seen Star Trek, Vulcans are these perfectly rational beings. They want to be disproven. For a Vulcan, if you show that they're wrong, the reaction is, thank you, now I'm no longer in error. How many political discussions have you had that have gone that way? Right? So I bring them up not because I think I'm a Vulcan, not because I think Vulcans should rule, but because when you look at the psychology, when you look at what democratic theorists write about democracy and the way democracy is supposed to work, they tend to assume we behave like Vulcans, but we don't. A good way of describing John Stuart Mill's hypothesis was that human beings are mostly hobbits, but if we get them to participate in politics, they'll become Vulcans. Schumpeter's claim is people are mostly hobbits and hooligans, and if you get them to participate more in politics, they'll become ever more hooliganish. I think, unfortunately, Schumpeter is mostly right. Now, why is this going on? Why do people behave like this? So in economics, we have a very basic theorem about information. It goes like this. People will consume and retain information if the benefits of that information exceed the costs. Very simple theorem. You will consume and retain information if the benefits of that information exceed the costs. For instance, and you'll forget it otherwise. Right? So that's a very simple idea. So why would they know about politics? Well, they probably won't. So think about what happens when I'm about to cross the street. Before I cross the street, I look both ways to see if cars are coming. Why? Not because I find traffic patterns intrinsically interesting. There are people that study that. I'm not one of them. Not because I'm like really into cars. I actually do like cars, but that's not the real reason. I'm looking because I want to know what's happening on the street, because that information is a life or death bit of information. Now suppose I see a Mack truck barreling towards me, and it occurs to me, that's not a regular Mack truck, that's Optimus Prime, my childhood hero from the Transformers, and he's coming right now to take me on an adventure to fight Megatron. Would I dare indulge that fantasy? No, because if I'm wrong, right? And I used to be an insurance adjuster, so I can tell you some people do that. right? But the reality punishes you for not knowing this information and rewards you for knowing it. And so in general, people tend to get better at this information over time. What about political information? Political information might be more like information about chemistry. I was a chemistry major for 3 years as an undergraduate, and I've forgotten almost all of it. I used to be fluent in Latin. Not anymore, right? I forgot almost everything. In fact, we have a bunch of high school students here, right? Like somewhere over, you guys say high school students? Yeah. So empirical studies show you will remember 20% of what you learn in high school. That's the number. You may be a little bit higher than average because you're more gifted, but if you get 25%, you'll be outstanding. Right? You forget it. You remember stuff at the test, and then you forget it because you don't need it anymore. Well, what about political information? The problem with political information is your individual vote just doesn't make much of a difference. You're not going to be rewarded for being right. You're not going to be punished for being wrong. So imagine that instead of this being a lecture, this were a class, and I'm the professor. And it's Microeconomics 101, and it's the first day, and I say, all right, there's roughly, 300 people in the room. So here's what's going to happen. 15 weeks from now, you're going to take a final exam on microeconomics, but I'm egalitarian, so what I'm going to do is, rather than you each getting your individual grade, I'm going to average all of your grades together, and everyone will get the same grade. So how much would you study in a class like that? So economists have actually tested this, and the answer is people don't study, and the average grade ends up being an F. The problem here is not that people are stupid. The problem is not that they're corrupt or that they're bad. It's that the rules disincentivize them from learning because their individual inputs don't make much of a difference. If you work really hard and study really hard and you get 100, you're still going to get an F on the test. And if you slack off, you're still going to get an F. It doesn't make a difference. And unfortunately, votes are like that as well. Now, economists disagree about what exactly is the probability that your individual vote will make a difference. It varies depending on the state you live in, the kind of voting system you have. Maybe it counts for more in Germany than it counts here because they have proportional voting. But in the American system, it roughly comes out to this. This is the debate. Some economists think that the probability your vote will decide the election in like a presidential election is roughly on par with the probability that when I drop this, it will spontaneously quantum tunnel through and appear on the other side. That's the pessimistic side. The optimistic side says that you might have as high as a 1 in 20 million chance of being decisive in a presidential election if you live in one of 4 select states. How many people here are from West Virginia? All right. On that model, your vote never matters. Right? Too bad. If you're from Ohio 2 elections ago, your vote probably mattered. Right? Virginia 2 elections ago, I had like a 1 in 20 million chance, but this last election, apparently I did not. So what does this mean about voter behavior? When you go and actually study how voters behave, what you find is that they are nice but ignorant and irrational. What I mean by nice is as follows. There's this myth we all subscribe to. It goes like this. Well, when I vote for justice and the common good and peace and love and prosperity, but my neighbors, they all vote for their pocketbooks because they're selfish, not like me. We're all right about ourselves and wrong about our neighbors. In fact, when we study people's political behavior, their self-interest is a very weak predictor of their voting behavior, which is weird because people are quite selfish overall, right? How many of you donate 50% of your income to like desperately poor people, right? Probably not very many, right? You know, how many of you ever donated a kidney to save a stranger's life? Not very many, okay? So we're generally pretty selfish. But it makes sense when it comes to voting because if the government were to say pass a law that said any money you make over $100,000 a year has a 100% tax rate, I would lose a ton of money. But if I vote for that, I lose nothing. It costs me nothing, and I get to show you and go, look at how nice I am. So it's easy, cheap altruism that has no effect. You might as well vote nicely. If you're selfish, you won't bother vote at all. You actually have a higher probability of being killed in a car crash on the way to the voting booth than you do of winning the election, of deciding the election. So voters vote cheap altruism. They vote for what they perceive to be the common good of their country. They're what we call nationalist sociotropes. But they're not very well informed, and they're not very rational. They measure up in motivation, but not cognition. So what do people know? Well, not very much. When we're examining voter behavior for about 60 years, polling them on this and that, and here's what they find. The average voter knows basically nothing. The voter right in the middle of distribution knows basically nothing. The typical voter knows basically nothing, but variance is high. Some people know a lot, some people know nothing, and some people actually know less than nothing. Right? So there's something conducted every 2 years called the American National Election Studies. What they do is they go and poll a bunch of people about various facts and ask them their opinions about this and that. In 1996, they asked some questions about like, well, which party is more conservative, Republicans or Democrats? So the top 25% of voters on this quiz, they basically got like an A-. Now it's not a very hard quiz, but that's like the top 25%. The middle 50% of voters, they did equivalent to chance. They got about a quarter of the answers right, which means we don't know if they know the answer to a quarter of the questions or they were just guessing, because people guess. But interestingly, the bottom 25% of voters did worse than chance on this test, and they do every year. So you go to the bottom 25% of voters, hey, who's more conservative, Bob Dole or Bill Clinton? And they're like, oh yeah, for sure, Bill Clinton, right? And these are pretty easy questions, right? You ask, like, and this is not just true of the United States, it's true of other countries as well. It's true of England, it's true of Germany. Ignorance is just a common feature of most democratic systems, right? Now, does information affect people's policy preferences? Here's how you would test it. What you can do with something like the American National Election Studies is, what this ends up doing is giving people a 3-part quiz. First, we ask them what they know, then we ask them what they want, and then we ask them who they are. So we get 3 bits of data. You can then statistically determine how does information affect people's policy preferences while controlling for the effect of their demographics. Interestingly, you find that information tends to push people in certain directions. They tend to be more in favor of like a more open economy. They tend to be more tolerant of difference. They don't really, for what it's worth, they don't really go Democratic and they don't really go Republican. The higher information voters don't really have beliefs that correspond with either major political party or any of the smaller parties either. Interestingly, if you go the other way and you simulate what would happen if people were perfectly uninformed, their votes end up being pretty similar to what they already are. All right? But it's not just that people are uninformed, it's worse, that they're irrational. They process information in a very biased way. And the reason they can afford to do so, again, is because you will not be punished by reality for being biased when it comes to politics. For most of us, our political beliefs do not serve the purpose of describing the world. The purpose of politics for most of us is to create coalitions with others. It is, I publicly display my political beliefs so that others that are like me will go, you're one of us, we like you, and I loudly denounce the other side so you know I'm very loyal to you because they're bad and I'm good. Politics is mostly about tribalism. So when we examine how people reason about politics, we find is that most of them are motivated to continue to believe whatever they currently believe. They're extremely biased in the sense that if you give them evidence somebody on their side did something wrong, they'll dismiss it. If you give them even weak evidence somebody on the other side did something wrong, they'll immediately accept it. They believe that people who disagree with them are evil and stupid. They only look at information that corresponds with their current views. They ignore information that doesn't correspond with their current views. There was a study done by a couple people out of Stanford where they would give people job applicants for like random jobs that have nothing to do with politics. And then they would say, let's say you're the Democrats and you're the Republicans, and I give you 2 job applicants, one of whom is clearly a Democrat and one of whom is clearly a Republican, and I make sure the Republican is actually much more qualified than the Democrat. The Democrats pick the Democrat every time, even when the Republican is more qualified. The Republicans pick the Republican every time, even when the Democrat is more qualified. That's how we behave, and we can afford to do so because our votes don't matter that much. So, is this a bad thing? Is this an injustice? We might just say it's okay because we're doing it to ourselves, but I think that's a mistake when we're thinking about democracy, right? Like if I decide to like get my like Iron Maiden out and put it in my ears and like blast it day after day after day, I'll probably go deaf. But you won't go deaf. You don't have any effects on you. Like I bear the cost of my decisions. When we vote, though, we're not just imposing costs and harms upon ourselves, we're imposing it upon everybody. People who dissent, people who can't vote, our children, teenagers, people in the future who have to bear the cost of our decisions, people outside of our country who bear the cost of our decisions. So here's why this might be worrisome from a standpoint of justice. Imagine that, I'll pick you, sorry, you've been accused of capital murder, and we're the jury, right? And during the case, all this evidence is presented to us, and now we go back to deliberate about whether you're guilty or not. And we're like, did you pay any attention to the facts of the case? And you're like, nah, it was really boring. I was just on my iPhone the whole time. Well, we have a transcript here of what happened. Should we read it? Nah, let's just go home. We'll flip a coin. Heads, he's guilty. Tails, he's not. Heads, you're guilty. Would you feel like you've been treated justly under that scenario? No. Probably not, right? What if instead we're like, look, clearly the evidence says that he's guilty, but I believe he's one of those lizard people, the reptilians that controls the world, and we should find him guilty to get rid of him. Right? And there's supposedly a certain percent of Americans believe that. When you survey them, they say they believe in the reptilian conspiracy. I don't know if they're just messing with survey people. I think maybe they are. So we find him guilty not because we're processing the information in a really irrational way. We probably are doing something unjust. Or what if we just decide to find you guilty because we don't like you? So we don't like people like you, so we're going to find you guilty. We consider that unjust. And in fact, that would be grounds for overturning the case. You're entitled to a fair trial, and if you can show that the jury was ignorant, incompetent, or badly motivated, that will overturn the case and you can get a new trial. I think that the electorate is in many ways like the jury in the following ways. The electorate has tremendous power over others. They can deprive them of life, liberty, and property. They impose their decision without real consent. I'll get to that, why it's not consensual. And they use violence and threats of violence to back up their claims. If a jury owes a defendant competence and good faith, perhaps we, the electorate, owe everyone else, including ourselves, competence and good faith. All right, so with that, I'm going to talk about, well, should we have democracy or some alternative to it? How would we analyze that? Right? Here I have a quotation from John Adams. He's not my favorite U.S. president. I think he was kind of a bad guy. But he says, I have to study war and matters of war and peace and politics so that my sons can have the power and the right to study architecture and business, so that my grandchildren can have the right to study porcelain and art. So John Adams was a political animal, if ever there was one, but he hoped that we would evolve into a higher form of life. And I think he was right to say that. All right? When we think about the kind of value that democracy has, there's three basic models of what sort of value it could have. One is, when you think about what makes a hammer valuable, right? The value of a hammer is not in and of itself. It's an instrument for achieving some other end. You would never insist on using a hammer when you need a wrench or a screwdriver. You would never insist on using a hammer if an even better hammer is available. Hammers merely have instrumental values. They're just tools. What if democracy is just a tool and that's all it is? But most people think democracy is more than that. They think it has a kind of value that a painting has, right? So paintings, we care about who made them. If Picasso scribbles on a napkin, that can be worth $50,000. If I make the exact same scribble on the exact same napkin, I've just ruined the napkin. Right? We think that we care about what it promotes and symbolizes and expresses. And also, we might think that democracy is an end in itself, the way that we think that people are ends in themselves. So my view in the book is really not that radical. I'm just saying I think democracy is a hammer, and that's it. And if we can find a better hammer, I'm not sure if we can, but if we can feel free to use it. So why would anyone disagree with that? Now, first of all, it is actually a very good hammer, right? So if we test things like respect for civil liberty and democracy, it turns out they go together. Empirically, democracy is correlated with respect for civil liberty. Empirically, it turns out that democracy is correlated with respect for economic freedom. Democracies tend to respect those more than non-democracies. Empirically, it turns out that democratic countries tend to be richer, and even the poor have more money than non-democratic countries. So democracy actually does perform really well, as does Iron Maiden. Right? Maybe it's the best system we can come up with, but it has these flaws which might make us wonder, can we find alternatives to it? But most people think democracy is not simply a tool for producing just ends. If that's all you think, then you'd be happy to replace it with anything that works better. They think that democracy is good as an end in itself. So one very common argument they'll say is, well, the thing about democracy is that it's fair. It gives everybody an equal chance. And as my colleague David Esselin liked to say, he's an ardent Democrat, but as he himself has said in print, if all you care about is fairness, you don't need to vote, you just need to flip a coin. Right? Fairness would mean we just pick things at random. We just write down everybody's opinion, we draw lots, it turns out you're queen for the day, you get to rule. That would be fair. In fact, that would be even more fair than what we actually do. In a sense, like what happens in a democracy is you get what we call persistent minorities, people who have ideological points of view that others disagree with, and as a result, they never are going to have a chance to get their way. So if we really cared about fairness, what we would do is perhaps have everybody vote, and then we would assign probabilities to candidates or to positions based upon the number of people who support it, and then we would use a random number generator to pick people. Now, under that system, that means that like the American Nazi Party would actually have a chance of winning. Right? Under that system, it would mean like really radical groups would have some very small chance of winning. So most people oppose that. They go, I don't want to give those people any chance at all. Maybe they're right to do so, but it shows that we don't simply care about fairness, we care about the quality of the outcome as well. The way that you do it and the quality of the outcome are not the same thing. Other people will say things like, but democracy is different because it empowers individuals. It gives you power. Well, that's a misunderstanding of what democracy is meant to do. It's not meant to give you power. It's meant to give us as a collective power. The whole point is to disempower individuals in favor of a collective, of the majority of the moment. You don't really have much power in a democracy. Right? You're not supposed to either. That's the point, right? Some people say, well, maybe it gives me autonomous control. That's what it does. It gives me some autonomy because I'm a member of a democratic polity. But again, that doesn't stand up to scrutiny because you just don't have that much control. Like if I wanted to test, do I have autonomous control over my left arm, I might run an experiment. I'm going to will it to move and we'll see what happens. Oh, okay. Now that's just one trial for the scientists in the room. That's not enough to make any statistically significant decisions. Now I'm going to test to see if I have autonomous control over the sun. I'm going to will it to come back up. Nope. All right. So I said it looks like when it comes to voting, when I vote, it's a little bit like willing the sun to set or willing the sun to rise. So I vote in particular ways, and not a single thing has ever happened as a result of it. If I voted against the last war, it wasn't like a single bullet was fired less. If I vote for different other policies, nothing happened as a result of it. It's not really fair to say they have autonomous control. So you might turn to other kinds of arguments. You might say, well, maybe what's good about democracy is that it's a way of expressing that everybody has equal value, right? So this famous politician and philosopher named Auburn Herbert said, what happens in democracy is that we used to have this view that the king had majesty, and we've worn out a capacity for giving majesty to the king and expressing majesty for the king, but what we've now done is given that majesty to all of us in virtue of voting in a democracy. Some people say things like, this is from Elizabeth Anderson, she says, we vote in part as an expression and symbolic affirmation of our value as our status as autonomous and self-governing beings who consider judgments or even opinions have to be given equal weight to those of others. She's right about this. This is in fact what we use democracy for. We use it as a way of expressing the idea that you are an equal and full member of society. But is it a good idea that we do that? Because there's lots of ways of expressing the idea that we're equal. One way we could express it is by having policies that produce just outcomes. One way you could express it is by having a statue of equality next to the Statue of Liberty. You could have a national equality where all get out every once a year and talk about equality. There's lots of ways of expressing the idea that we're equal. Giving everyone an equal vote is just one way of doing that. Notice, I am not legally allowed to practice plumbing, and I'm not legally allowed to practice medicine. But no one thinks that demotes my status. But we do think if you don't have the right to vote, it does. So why? Why do we think that? Well, one thought is that if we don't let some people vote, that's like the government saying something mean about you, right? It's like saying you don't count as much, you're not as important, your vote doesn't matter, your voice doesn't matter. So imagine my brother-in-law, David, is a surgeon. Imagine he walks around Target doing the following. He goes up to people and goes, hey, do you have a medical degree? You're like, no. And he's like, well, I do. I know more about medicine than you. How's that? Ha! That would make him a jerk, right? But there might be cases where it's called for to go around saying who knows more than others. So for example, if somebody starts choking and someone's life is at stake, at that point it's really worth saying some people know more than others when it comes to this issue. David should be the one who takes care of that person. And if we were standing right next to him, we're like, hey, Dr. David, just because you went to fancy medical school doesn't mean you should have to take care of this person. I should get a chance to save them instead. You'd be being the jerk. So the situation matters. There are times when it matters we identify who's competent and who's not. And so the worry here might be that if we're just having everyone vote, what if we're getting worse government and that's a problem? So I think my worry here is that the fact that we use democracy to symbolize everybody's equal may simply be a contingent way we happen to do things. It's not written into the fabric of the universe we have to do it. So to illustrate that, I want you to imagine a society like ours that does things a little bit differently. In this society, at age 18, you get a red scarf from the government, and you wear the red scarf around. But now a new political party comes to power, and they don't pick a group, Jews. So what they do is they no longer give red scarves to Jews. They take them away, and if you're Jewish, you don't get one. Now, in a world like that, it would be the government basically giving them the finger. It would be the government insulting them, and we would have reason to get on the streets and march and demand that Jewish people get their scarves back, right? Given all the meaning that we've put into the red scarf, for you not to get a red scarf is to be insulted and maligned and treated badly. But at the same time, we sitting here in this room recognize that it's just a weird cultural construct among these people that they use the red scarf that way. Red scarves don't have to mean that. So for them it does, but it doesn't for us. When we can start asking, is it a good idea to imbue that with all of this meaning? Right? So this is true of lots of different cultures. Like, here's some real cases. The great Darius had conquered many peoples, including the Galatians and the Greeks. And he gets them together and he says, Greeks and Galatians, we all agree that when our fathers die, we have to do something to express respect for our fathers, right? And they're like, yes, we absolutely have to. That's incredibly important. Greeks, let me ask you, what do you do with your dads when they die? How do you express respect for them? And the Greeks say, oh, that's easy. We burn them on a funeral pyre. After all, that symbolically releases their soul into the afterlife, and that would be really the nice thing to do. Fair enough, Greeks. Would you ever consider, eating your dead as a way of expressing respect? And they go, oh, that very thought horrifies us because that would corrupt the very meaning of a funeral. Eating is what you do with food. The way you show respect for your dead is you burn them. Fair enough, got it. Galatians, let me ask you. You think it's incredibly important that when your father dies, you express respect for him, right? And you, the Galatians, go, yes, that's incredibly important. Tell me, how do you express respect for your dead? And they say, oh, that's easy. We eat them. Right? We eat our dad when he dies. The reason for this is that then part of his body lives on through you and lives on through every subsequent generation. He never really dies. Some people are making horror faces. I think that's beautiful. I hope my kids eat me. It's a beautiful idea, right? And he's like, would you consider burning your dead? And they said, who would do that? What barbarians would burn their dead? Burning is what you do with your trash. You burn your trash to get rid of it. So if you burn your dead, that's like you're saying your dad is a piece of trash. So what's going on here is that both cultures agree that it is important to express respect for the others, but they disagree about how to do it. In a sense, they've constructed two different ritualistic languages through which to express respect, and on its face, there's not any particular reason to prefer one to the other, unless we discover that there are some costs associated with one. And it turns out the Galatians actually had kind of a bad idea, because eating the dead is really dangerous. So the Foray tribe of Papua New Guinea used to practice what we call endocannibalism. They would eat the brains of their dead upon death. However, it turned out that this spreads a disease which causes your brain to atrophy, killing you, then they eat your brain and then they die. When that tribe discovered this happened, they changed their practice and went with burial. Right? We might similarly change our practices if we discover that there's a cost to them. So for instance, if I were to go up to a random person and say the English words, go to hell, that would express contempt. But suppose we discovered a new law of physics that went as follows. So it turns out when you say go to hell in English, this causes weird vibrations in the air. And when the vibrations get to your body, it makes the molecules in your body vibrate. And then if you have any cancerous cells, it kills them. So it turns out saying go to hell cures cancer. Now if a person discovered that, we would give that person the Nobel Prize in medicine and physics. And what else would we do? We'd probably modify our language so that go to hell becomes a way of respecting people. You'd walk up to people and go to hell. Thank you, you go to hell. Right? So these things, the ways we use to express respect for one another, if there isn't any harm involved or an exploitation or other things, this is just something we could, in principle, modify. So this leaves us to one final question. Given that democracy has this problem, it incentivizes people to be badly informed and to be irrational, is there a way of fixing that? And there are a number of possible alternatives that are up kind of on the board and being discussed right now. And there's worries about each of them. There's worries about whether governments will abuse them. There's worries about whether we'll tailor this to exclude people we don't like. We also have, obviously, a dangerous history with some of these ideas as well. So one idea is something called predictocracy. This is something that's being advocated by an economist named Robin Hanson at George Mason University. The idea behind predictocracy is that we should have people place bets, and there's a way of doing betting markets that you can use to choose policy. Why would he say this? So in an economist terms, a bet is a tax on BS. What I mean by that is as follows. If I just say something, if I make a prediction about the future, it simply elicits your approval or disapproval, and that's all it does. So if I say, Donald Trump is going to cause World War III, all that happens is a few of you think I'm an idiot for saying that, a few of you are like, yeah, I agree, a few of you are kind of mad, and some of you don't care. That's all that happens when I say that, right? But now suppose I say, Donald Trump is going to cause World War III. The US and Russia will be at war within 4 years. And then you say, oh yeah, I want to bet? Want to bet on that? Suddenly what happens is I will get punished for being wrong and rewarded for being right. And try this with people. I do it all the time. It makes me fun at parties. Ask them if they want to bet on their beliefs. And most of them will calm down because they don't genuinely believe it, right? They're just emoting, right? Ask them to place a bet. Do they actually think this is true? It turns out that when you get people to bet on the future, to make predictions and bet on that, and you have markets where people trade back and forth predictions, it does a much better job of predicting the future than asking experts, polling people, or basically anything else. So there's some work in progress called predictocracy about how could you use this to govern. So that's one idea. Another idea is something called lawtocracy. It's advocated by a number of people like Alex Guerrero at Rutgers and a few others. And the idea is that what we should do is just randomly select a small subset of citizens, say 5,000 or so, and imbue them with power. And the thought is that maybe if we randomly select them, we get even demographics, we're not privileging any group over others, but because we make their votes significant enough, maybe they'll invest more in knowledge and make better choices. And finally, another alternative is something called epistocracy, meaning rule of the knowers, rule of the wise, rule of people who know more. In an epistocratic system, in one way or another, you do something to weight votes according to knowledge. Now, the crudest version of this, which is not the version I advocate, so you don't have to ask me about it, at least not the version I'm defending, would be something like this. You don't get to vote unless you can pass the test showing that you're fully knowledgeable, or knowledgeable enough. That would probably be subject to rampant abuse, it would probably be racist and other kinds of problems. It wouldn't work, so it's not a good idea. John Stuart Mill, in the book that I talked about earlier, he advocated what he called plural voting, which is everybody gets one vote, but some people who can prove their credentials and knowledge get additional votes. That probably also has those problems. So a third way of doing it, a way that would not have these problems, is what you might call government by simulated oracle. The way it works is as follows. On election day, everybody gets to vote, even toddlers. Under this system, why not? It won't harm anything. Literally, everyone can vote. But when they vote, they have to do three things. They tell us what it is they want, they tell us who they are, and we just give them a test of very basic questions about what's going on in the country. Can you name what's in the First Amendment? What year is the country founded? What's the unemployment rate? Can you estimate that within 5 percentage points? Who's the current president? Who's your current congressperson? By the way, most Americans don't know the answer to that. Give them a multiple choice test, they can't pick it. Just basic questions like that. When you get those three sets of bits of data, what people want, what they know, and who they are, you can then, as I mentioned before, statistically estimate what would the country want, what would a demographically identical United States want if it were fully informed. You take this data, you release it to all the newspapers so that everyone can check it, and you can then use that to estimate what we should do. Instead of asking what the unenlightened public wants, you estimate what the enlightened public would want. What's nice about this system is no one gets excluded, no one actually gets an additional vote, no one gets extra votes, but it's a way of extracting wisdom from the crowds. Now, are these things going to work? The answer is we don't really know, right? In a sense, what I'm doing today is kind of like what a Democrat would have been doing in the year say it's 1795, and you're advocating democracy, and you have these theoretical arguments about why it might be an improvement over monarchy. You don't really know. You don't have many attempts with it, you don't have many trials. All you have at that point in 1795 is like the French democracy, that went really badly. The French Revolution was a disaster. American democracy, it's not really obviously much better off than it was under the British system, maybe a little, not obviously much. You wouldn't really know, but now, after a couple hundred years of experimentation, we know it does tend to work better. So similarly, maybe these work better, maybe they don't. But we don't have even the opportunity to test them or think about them if we continue to think that democracy is simply a sacred value that can't be challenged. So really all I'm advocating is further research, possible experimentation, and if it works, scale it up. If it doesn't work, then don't. Right? So with that, that's it. That's my view on is democracy the best system? It's the best of, as Winston Churchill says, it is the worst system except for all the others that have been tried from time to time. Fair enough. Maybe we should try something else, though. So with that, we've got time for Q&A, objections, and that kind of thing. So the question was about when the American founders were crafting the Constitution, you're right, they used the word democracy as a slur word. It was a bad word. They advocated republicanism, not democracy. And they wanted a mixed system. They did not want the public to just control everything. And the purpose of the system was to be something in which elites who knew more would act more, but they were in some way beholden to the masses, so they wouldn't just act in their own interests. But then over time, as you said, we've gotten to be more populist, and so we've spread the power out more. So examples of this are, it used to be you could not directly elect senators, now you can. It used to be they were selected by your state representatives. The amount of power we exercise over the presidency is higher than it used to be in the past. The amount of power we exercise over many other offices is higher as well, right? So one question is, to what degree do these current systems tend to filter government? I think to a certain degree they do quite a bit, actually. And sometimes for better and sometimes for worse. So it turns out, like, I work in Washington. There are all these ABC kind of bureaucracies there, and they're not completely under the control of Congress, and they're not completely under control of the presidency. Sometimes that should make you happy, and sometimes that should really worry you, right? But it is true that the government is not simply going to do whatever the majority of the moment wants at any given time. It's not like whatever the majority wanted on November 8th will suddenly get implemented the next day. So really the question for me is, like, how much influence do we have? And is it mostly pernicious or not? Now, one thing I do notice is that thanks to the Brexit vote, I've been spending a lot of time in Europe for various reasons, because Brexit made this book basically popular. Thanks Brexit. It made me money, I guess. So I've been spending a lot of time in Europe, and one thing I've noticed there is that everyone now hates referenda, right? Everyone's now like, this is why we have parliamentary democracy. We elect these people who are supposed to think for us and represent us, but they're not just going to do exactly what we want. And this is really the essential tension that we have all the time with any kind of democrat, any kind of form of government. If you concentrate power in the hands of a very small number of people, those people have a very strong incentive to think carefully about how they use it and to use that power for themselves. And if we spread power out very widely, people have no incentive to be selfish, so they're like, yay, niceness, but they don't think about what they're doing and they use it unwisely. So we have the choice between dumb and nice and mean and smart. And so what we want is, like, the purpose of, like, a Republican system and even these other systems is an attempt to split the difference. Nice but smart. That's what we really want. How do we get it? No one's figured it out yet. There's an economist named Jim Buchanan from Virginia, or she's from North Carolina, I guess, originally, who won a Nobel Prize in 1986 for the following thought: people are people. It's a very simple idea. He thought, when we're, in our day-to-day lives, fairly selfish, though somewhat altruistic, some are more altruistic than others, and he thought, when you put people in government and give them a lot of power, that does not magically transform them into saints, right? People are going to be roughly the same. They're going to be, if they're relatively selfish in their day-to-day lives, they'll probably be relatively selfish in government as well, right? And then he basically tried to figure out, what does this predict about how government works, and it had a lot of predictive power. So I guess I'm saying, like, I don't think that the people who are going to form part of government are going to be saintly. Some of them will be publicly spirited, some more than others, but they're mostly going to be regular people. They'll have interests of their own, private interests of their own, and we basically can't count on virtue. Virtue is in relatively short supply, and that's why we have these institutions that constrain us, that are meant to, like, prevent us from having that. So I guess what I'm saying is that, if we concentrate power in the hands of the few, we're just not likely to find those saints. Like, if there's all this power available, there's going to be two different sets of people competing for that power. People who want to use that power for good, and people who want to use that power for their own ends. And the people who want to use the power for their own ends are going to have quite a bit of an advantage, because being unscrupulous, they won't be constrained by certain ways of competing for it, right? And so when we go to study what government does, this is what we find. We find lots of things. Government does lots of things that are really wonderful. It also does lots of things that are really terrible. Like, a really simple example of this. Why is there corn syrup in Coca-Cola in the United States, but not in Mexico, right? This is why. Because a company called Archer Daniels Midland, this is in textbooks, they've heard this. Like, Archer Daniels Midland goes to the government every year and goes, hey, what if you tax the rest of them and give us a bunch of money? And they're like, sure. And what if you put a tariff on sugar and give us a bunch, and so that no one can compete with us? And the government says, sure. And the reason this happens is because the benefits are concentrated in the hands of the few, and the costs of this behavior are spread among us, the many. So we don't have any incentive to know about it or to fight it, and they have every incentive to lobby about it. And so a lot of what happens in Washington, D.C. is small special interest groups that have a concentrated benefit lobby for that benefit for themselves, and they stick the rest of us with the cost. Yeah, a very good question. So in a sense, yes, how much is in dispute, but think of it, this is a very simple model. Just think of it as different parties have different political leanings. None of them are unanimously able to implement whatever they want right away. I mean, as proof of that, the Republicans control everything, and they're not passing any legislation right now. So even they can't just jam things through. But if you think of parties as having a leaning one way or another, when you elect that party, you just nudge the system a little bit. Doesn't mean you have a huge effect, but you nudge it a little bit. So if you elect the more warmongering party, you'll have a little bit more violence. If you elect the less, we'll have a little bit less. But it's not to say that they're just going to do whatever they want. And I'm glad you asked the question about randomness, because a lot of people are asking me about, like, well, why did this happen and this happen? And our kind of bias is to think that everything happens for a reason in politics, and in fact, it doesn't. So an economist named Kenneth Arrow back in the 50s had something called Arrow's impossibility theorem. And I'm not going to go through the whole math of it for you like this, but this is just what it means. If you, sir, prefer chocolate ice cream to vanilla ice cream, and you prefer vanilla ice cream to strawberry ice cream, it follows that right now you prefer chocolate ice cream to strawberry ice cream. We call that transitivity of preferences. If you prefer A to B and B to C, you prefer A to C. What Arrow was able to show is that when you have all of us vote and try to aggregate our preferences together, what you get very commonly in a democracy is a situation in which the majority prefers chocolate to vanilla, it prefers vanilla to strawberry, and it prefers strawberry to chocolate. Which is weird, but that's what happens when you try to aggregate voting preferences. And the result of this, what this predicts, is that you'll get random vacillation in government for no reason at all. So if you want to know why a party won or lost, sometimes the answer is because it's random, right? Because of something built in with what happens with voting, not because of any real major event. So I think you're right. I think voting parties do matter, they do make a difference, and at the same time, you're correct to say that lots of stuff that is happening is simply random. The who decide question is always going to be the hard one. But in a sense, like when we compare, say, the performance of monarchies versus democracies, when we say democracies do better, we look at a lot of different factors: health, wealth, income, levels of consideration. Do they believe the system is legitimate? Immigration rates in and out, and all these other things. And sometimes you get a preponderance of evidence by just looking at all the different things people care about. So what I want to do in terms of experiments, to start with, literally just try laboratory experiments and see kind of what works in those. See how they kind of function. And then eventually, if you get enough data on this, try it in a small scale. Like take a relatively non-corrupt town in a relatively non-corrupt state or a non-corrupt country. So, Hudson, New Hampshire, where I'm from. New Hampshire is, of course, the best state. Really, you can just look at the stuff like it is, right? New Hampshire, take Hudson, New Hampshire, and try it there and see what happens. And if it's a mess, don't do it. And if it works pretty well, then maybe others will copy it. In a sense, I think that's how social change generally works. Why did countries become more democratic over time? Because a couple countries experimented with it, it went pretty well, and others eventually started to copy them. So I really just mean start on a small scale with like actual experimentation with governments and then work its way upward from there. I would not want to do like a Leninist vanguard thing where I force this down everyone's throats overnight, because one thing we know is that like any new system, there are going to be unforeseen consequences and unintended consequences, and we can't predict those. So we have to try it and see what happens. Well, as you're pointing out, we already are in a sense away from one person, one vote, right? It's just not the case that everyone's votes count for equally. Like when on a presidential election, my vote counts for more than yours because I live, are you from West Virginia? Okay, so just because of the state that we live in, but my vote counts for less than certain other people that live in smaller, less populous counties. My district has been gerrymandered to make sure that Jerry Connolly, my neighbor, always gets reelected. So you're right, like we already have that kind of problem. Maybe this would overcome it to some degree. The system I'm talking about where everyone gets to, even toddlers get to vote, and you do the weighting after taking the quiz and after correcting for the demographics, it in a sense opens it up even more. But I think the worry here is that people are going to try to game this system for their own benefit. And that is exactly correct. So I say in the book, one thing I do not want to do is try to compare the idealized conception of one system to a realistic description of the other. Right? That would be kind of a mistake. Right? So my friend and colleague, Michael Munger, has a story about North Carolina, and he says, in North Carolina, we basically have these state fairs, which are beauty contests for animals. And he says, now imagine like we're having the pig contest, the big, pretty pig contest. And there are only 2 entrants this year because while many pigs are pretty and many pigs are big, there aren't many that are both pretty and big. And I'm the judge, and I come up, I haven't even looked at the second pig yet. I look at the first pig and I go, that pig is ugly, let me award it to the second pig. The mistake here is like I should take a look at the second pig as well. So, and it would also be like crazy for me to just assume the second pig must be perfectly beautiful. So in a sense, every single system is going to be subject to abuse. Everyone is going to try to gain it for their own power at the expense of others. This one is all these other ones on the board as well. People will try to game them. So the question for me is not, is it going to be perfect? It's rather, which system, warts and all, will end up working better? Right? Which will work better, including all of its flaws and problems. So in certain ways, these things are trying to correct for some of the problems. They might open up to others. One potential problem is, well, what goes on the quiz? So here's what I would actually recommend. You're going to think this is paradoxical, but I'll try to defend it. The question of what are we going to use as the knowledge test, I would leave that open to democratic decision making. Democracies get to decide what's on the test, which you then use to weight votes on the simulated oracle. That might seem weird because I just told you that democracies are really bad at making these decisions, aren't they? Not exactly. In a sense, the question of what does it take to be an informed voter is a really easy question, and then the question of actually having that information is really hard. This is what I've noticed. I wrote a book on the ethics of voting many years ago, and it was all about what does it mean to be an informed voter, what does it mean to be an ethical voter, and then when I go and talk to random people in the street about it, they give me my theory back to me even though they haven't read me. Right? They're like, oh, you need to know this, you need to know that, you need to know this other stuff. But then if you go and see, do people actually have that information? They don't. Similarly, if you ask my 6-year-old, what makes for a good spouse, I asked him, he actually has a pretty good account of what makes for a good spouse, but he's not really competent right now to actually choose a wife for himself. He's too young, right? Or me at age 20, between basically, puberty until I met my now current wife, if you ask me what makes for a good girlfriend, I had a really good theory of it, and then when you asked me to apply it, I messed it up every single time. Right? If you ask people what makes for a good president, they'll give you a really good abstract theory of it, and then when you ask them to apply it to real life people, we get kind of crummy candidates on both sides over and over again. So I think in a sense, the question of what does it take to be informed, we can ask the average person that, and they'll give us a pretty good account of what you need to know. They'll say the same stuff I do. Oh, you should know this, 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 and this. And then we'll ask, well, do you actually know that? And they're like, no. So I think the question, what goes on the test, we can let democracy decide that, and then we use that to then weight votes under this complicated system to try to extract wisdom from the crowd.